Clippings from newspapers. This article is from the Daily Inter-Ocean, Chicago, December 31, 1894. The Great Awakening of the time of Jonathan Edwards has been paralleled during the last decade by a wave of idealism that has swept over the country, manifesting itself under several different aspects and under various names, but each having the common identity of spiritual demand. This movement, under the guise of Christian Science, and ingeniously calling out a closer inquiry into Oriental philosophy, prefigures itself to us as one of the most potent factors in the social evolution of the last quarter of the 19th century. History shows the curious fact that the closing years of every century are years of more intense life, manifested in unrest or in aspiration, and scholars of special research, like Professor Max Muller, assert that the end of a cycle, as is the latter part of the present century, is marked by peculiar intimations of man's immortal life. The completion of the first Christian Science church erected in Boston strikes a keynote of definite attention. This church is in the fashionable Back Bay, between Commonwealth and Huntington Avenues. It is one of the most beautiful and is certainly the most unique structure in any city. The First Church of Christ Scientist, as it is officially called, is termed by its founder, quote, "our prayer in stone," end quote. It is located at the intersection of Norway and Falmouth Streets, on a triangular plot of ground, the design a Romanesque tower with a circular front and an octagonal form, accented by stone porticos and turreted corners. On the front is a marble tablet with the following inscription carved in bold relief. Quote, "The First Church of Christ Scientist, erected Anno Domini 1894, a testimonial to our beloved teacher, the Reverend Mary Baker Eddy, discoverer and founder of Christian Science, author of Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, president of the Massachusetts Metaphysical College, and the first pastor of this denomination," end quote. The church edifice. The church is built of Concord granite in light gray, with trimmings of the pink granite of New Hampshire, Mrs. Eddy's native state. The architecture is Romanesque throughout. The tower is 120 feet in height and 21.5 feet square. The entrances are of marble, with doors of antique oak richly carved. The windows of stained glass are very rich in pictorial effect. The lighting and cooling of the church, for cooling is a recognized feature as well as heating, are done by electricity, and the heat generated by 2 large boilers in the basement is distributed by the 4 systems with motor electric power. The partitions are of iron, the floors of marble in mosaic work, and the edifice is therefore as literally fireproof as is conceivable. The principal features are the auditorium, seating 1,100 people and capable of holding 1,500. The mother's room, designed for the exclusive use of Mrs. Eddy. the director's room, and the vestry. The girders are all of iron. The roof is of terracotta tiles. The galleries are in plaster relief. The window frames are of iron, coated with plaster. The staircases are of iron, with marble stairs of rose pink and marble approaches. The vestibule is a fitting entrance to this magnificent temple. In the ceiling is a sunburst with a 7-pointed star which illuminates it. From this are the entrances leading to the auditorium, the mother's room, and the director's room. The auditorium is seated with pews of curly birch, upholstered in old rose plush. The floor is in white Italian mosaic, with frieze of the old rose, and the wainscoting repeats the same tints. The base and cap are of pink Tennessee marble. On the walls are bracketed oxidized silver lamps of Roman design, and there are frequent illuminated texts from the Bible and from Mrs. Eddy's Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, impaneled. A sunburst in the center of the ceiling takes the place of chandeliers. There is a disc of cut glass in decorative designs, covering 144 electric lights in the form of a star, which is 21 inches from point to point, the center being of pure white light, and each ray under prisms which reflect the rainbow tints. The galleries are richly paneled in relief work. The organ and choir gallery is spacious and rich beyond the power of words to depict. The platform, corresponding to the chancel of an Episcopal church, is a mosaic work, with richly carved seats following the sweep of its curve, with a lampstand of the Renaissance period on either end, bearing 6 richly wrought oxidized silver lamps, 8 feet in height. The great organ comes from Detroit. It is one of vast compass, with aeolian attachment, and cost $11,000. It is the gift of a single individual, a votive offering of gratitude for the healing of the wife of the donor. The chime of bells includes 15, of fine range and perfect tone. The Mother's Room. The Mother's Room is approached by an entrance of Italian marble, and over the door in large golden letters on a marble tablet is the word love. In this room, the mosaic marble floor of white has a Romanesque border and is decorated with sprays of fig leaves bearing fruit. The room is toned in pale green with relief in old rose. The mantel is of onyx and gold. Before the great bay window hangs an Athenian lamp over 200 years old, which will be kept always burning, day and night. Leading off the mother's room are toilet apartments with full-length French mirrors and every convenience. The director's room is very beautiful in marble approaches and rich carving, and off this is a vault for the safe preservation of papers. The vestry seats 800 people, and opening from it are 3 large classrooms and the pastor's study. The windows are a remarkable feature of this temple. There are no memorial windows. The entire church is a testimonial, not a memorial, a point that the members strongly insist upon. In the auditorium are 2 rose windows, one representing the heavenly city which cometh down from God out of heaven, with 6 small windows beneath, emblematic of the 6 water pots referred to in John 2, verse 6. The other rose window represents the raising of the daughter of Jairus. Beneath are 2 small windows bearing palms of victory, and others with lamps, typical of science and health. Another great window tells its pictorial story of the 4 Marys: the mother of Jesus, Mary anointing the head of Jesus, Mary washing the feet of Jesus, Mary at the resurrection, and the woman spoken of in the Apocalypse, chapter 12, God crowned. One more window in the auditorium represents the raising of Lazarus. In the gallery are windows representing John on the Isle of Patmos and others of pictorial significance. In the mother's room, the windows are of still more unique interest. A large bay window, composed of 3 separate panels, is designed to be wholly typical of the work of Mrs. Eddy. The central panel represents her in solitude and meditation, searching the Scriptures by the light of a single candle, while the Star of Bethlehem shines down from above. Above this is a panel containing the Christian Science seal, and other panels are decorated with emblematic designs with the legends, "Heal the sick," "Raise the dead," "Cleanse the lepers," and "Cast out demons." The cross and the crown and the star are presented in appropriate decorative effect. The cost of this church is $221,000, exclusive of the land, a gift from Mrs. Eddy, which is valued at some $40,000. The Order of Service. The order of service in the Christian Science Church does not differ widely from that of any other sect, save that its service includes the use of Mrs. Eddy's book, entitled Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, in perhaps equal measure to its use of the Bible. The reading is from the 2 alternately. The singing is from the compilation called the Christian Science Hymnal. But its songs are for the most part those devotional hymns from Herbert, Faber, Robertson, Wesley, Bowring, and other recognized devotional poets, with selections from Whittier and Lowell, as are found in the hymn books of the Unitarian churches. For the past year or 2, Judge Hanna, formerly of Chicago, has filled the office of pastor to the church in this city, which held its meetings in Chickering Hall, and later in Copley Hall, in the new Grundman Studio building on Copley Square. Preceding Judge Hanna were Reverend D.A. Easton and Reverend L.P. Norcross, both of whom had formerly been congregational clergymen. The organizer and first pastor of the church here was Mrs. Eddy herself, of whose work I shall venture to speak a little later in this article. Last Sunday, I gave myself the pleasure of attending the service held in Copley Hall. The spacious apartment was thronged with a congregation whose remarkable earnestness impressed the observer. There was no straggling of latecomers. Before the appointed hour, every seat in the hall was filled, and a large number of chairs pressed into service for the overflowing throng. The music was spirited, and the selections from the Bible and from Science and Health were finally read by Judge Hannah. Then came his sermon, which dealt directly with the command of Christ to heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. In his admirable discourse, Judge Hannah said that while all these injunctions could, under certain conditions, be interpreted and fulfilled literally, the special lesson was to be taken spiritually, to cleanse the leprosy of sin, to cast out the demons of evil thought. The discourse was able and helpful in its suggestive interpretation. The church members. Later, I was told that almost the entire congregation was composed of persons who had either been themselves or had seen members of their own families healed by Christian Science treatment. And I was further told that once, when a Boston clergyman remonstrated with Judge Hannah for enticing a separate congregation rather than offering their strength to unite with churches already established, I was told, he replied, that the Christian Science Church did not recruit itself from other churches, but from the graveyards. The church numbers now 4,000 members, but this estimate, as I understand, is not limited to the Boston adherents, but includes those all over the country. The ceremonial of uniting is to sign a brief confession of faith written by Mrs. Eddy, and to unite in communion, which is not celebrated by outward symbols of bread and wine, but by uniting in silent prayer. The confession of faith includes the declaration that the Scriptures are the guide to eternal life, that there is a supreme being and his Son and the Holy Ghost, and that man is made in his image. It affirms the atonement. It recognizes Jesus as the teacher and guide to salvation, the forgiveness of sin by God, and affirms the power of truth over error, and the need of living faith at the moment to realize the possibilities of the divine life. The entire membership of Christian Scientists throughout the world now exceeds 200,000 people. The church in Boston was organized by Mrs. Eddy, and the first meeting held on April 12, 1879. It opened with 26 members, and within 15 years it has grown to its present impressive proportions, and has now its own magnificent church building, costing over $200,000 and entirely paid for when its consecration service on January 6 shall be celebrated. This is certainly a very remarkable retrospect. Reverend Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of this denomination and discoverer of Christian Science, as they term her work in affirming the present application of the principles asserted by Jesus, is a most interesting personality. At the risk of colloquialism, I am tempted to begin at the beginning of my own knowledge of Mrs. Eddy, and take as the point of departure my first meeting with her and the subsequent development of some degree of familiarity with the work of her life, which that meeting inaugurated for me. Mrs. Eddy. It was during some year in the early 80s that I became aware, from that close contact with public feeling resulting from editorial work in daily journalism, that the Boston atmosphere was largely thrilled and pervaded by a new and increasing interest in the dominance of mind over matter, and that the central figure in all this agitation was Mrs. Eddy. To a note which I wrote her, begging the favor of an interview for press use, she most kindly replied, naming an evening on which she would receive me. At the hour named, I rang the bell at a spacious home on Columbus Avenue, and I was hardly more than seated before Mrs. Eddy entered the room. She impressed me as singularly graceful and winning in bearing and manner, and with great claim to personal beauty. Her figure was tall, slender, and as flexible in movement as that of a Delsarte disciple. Her face, framed in dark hair and lighted by luminous blue eyes, had the transparency and rose flush of tint so often seen in New England, and she was magnetic, earnest, impassioned. No photographs can do the least justice to Mrs. Eddy, as her beautiful complexion and changeful expression cannot thus be reproduced. At once one would perceive that she had the temperament to dominate, to lead, to control, not by any crude self-assertion, but a spiritual animus. Of course, such a personality, with the wonderful tumult in the air that her large and enthusiastic following excited, fascinated the imagination. What had she originated? I mentally questioned this modern St. Catherine, who was dominating her followers like any abbess of old. She told me the story of her life, so far as outward events may translate those inner experiences which alone are significant. Mary Baker was the daughter of Mark and Abigail Ambrose Baker, and was born in Concord, New Hampshire, somewhere in the early decade of 1820-30. At the time I met her, she must have been some 60 years of age, yet she had the coloring and the elastic bearing of a woman of 30, and this, she told me, was due to the principles of Christian Science. On her father's side, Mrs. Eddy came from Scotch and English ancestry, and Hannah More was a relative of her grandmother. Deacon Ambrose, her maternal grandfather, was known as a godly man, and her mother was a religious enthusiast, a saintly and consecrated character. One of her brothers, Albert Baker, graduated at Dartmouth and achieved eminence as a lawyer. Mrs. Eddy as a child. As a child, Mary Baker saw visions and dreamed dreams. When 8 years of age, she began, like Joan d'Arc, to hear voices. And for a year she heard her name called distinctly, and would often run to her mother, questioning if she were wanted. One night, the mother related to her the story of Samuel, and bade her, if she heard the voice again, to reply as he did, "Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth." The call came, but the little maid was afraid and did not reply. This caused her tears of remorse, and she prayed for forgiveness and promised to reply if the call came again. It came, and she answered as her mother had bidden her, and after that it ceased. These experiences, of which Catholic biographies are full, and which history not infrequently emphasizes, certainly offer food for meditation. Theodore Parker related that when he was a lad, at work in a field one day on his father's farm in Lexington, an old man with a snowy beard suddenly appeared at his side and walked with him as he worked, giving him high counsel and serious thought. All inquiry in the neighborhood as to whence the stranger came or whither he went was fruitless. No one else had seen him, and Mr. Parker always believed, so a friend had told me, that his visitor was a spiritual form from another world. It is certainly true that many persons whose life has been destined to more than ordinary achievement have had experiences of voices or visions in their early youth. At an early age, Miss Baker was married to Colonel Glover of Charleston, South Carolina, who lived only a year. She returned to her father's home in 1844, and from that time until 1866, no special record is to be made. In 1866, while living in Lynn, Massachusetts, Mrs. Eddy met with a severe accident, and her case was pronounced hopeless by the physicians. There came a Sunday morning when her pastor came to bid her goodbye before proceeding to his morning service, as there was no probability that she would be alive at its close. During this time, she suddenly became aware of a divine illumination and ministration. She requested those with her to withdraw, and reluctantly they did so, believing her delirious. Soon, to their bewilderment and fright, she walked into the adjoining room, and they thought I had died and that it was my apparition, she said. The principle of divine healing. From that hour dated her conviction of the principle of divine healing, and that it is as true today as it was in the days when Jesus of Nazareth walked the earth. I felt that the divine Spirit had wrought a miracle, she said, in reference to this experience. How, I could not tell, but later I found it to be in perfect scientific accord with the divine law. From 1866 to 1869, Mrs. Eddy withdrew from the world to meditate, to pray, to search the Scriptures. During this time, she said, in reply to my questions, the Bible was my only textbook. It answered my questions as to the process by which I was restored to health. It came to me with a new meaning, and suddenly I apprehended the spiritual meaning of the teaching of Jesus and the principle and the law involved in spiritual science and metaphysical healing. In a word, Christian Science. Mrs. Eddy came to perceive that Christ's healing was not miraculous, but was simply a natural fulfillment of divine law, a law as operative in the world today as it was 1900 years ago. Divine science is begotten of spirituality, she says, since only the pure in heart can see God. In writing of this experience, Mrs. Eddy has said, I had learned that thought must be spiritualized in order to apprehend spirit. It must become honest, unselfish, and pure in order to have the least understanding of God in divine science. The first must become last. Our reliance upon material things must be transferred to a perception of and dependence on spiritual things. For spirit to be supreme in demonstration, it must be supreme in our affections, and we must be clad with divine power. I had learned that mind reconstructed the body, and that nothing else could. All science is a revelation. Through homeopathy, too, Mrs. Eddy became convinced of the principle of mind healing, discovering that the more attenuated the drug, the more potent was its effects. In 1877, Mrs. Glover married Dr. Asa Gilbert Eddy of Londonderry, Vermont, a physician who had come into sympathy with her own views and who was the first to place Christian Scientist on the sign at his door. Dr. Eddy died in 1882, a year after her founding the Metaphysical College in Boston, in which he taught. The work in the Metaphysical College lasted 9 years, and it was closed in 1889 in the very zenith of its prosperity, as Mrs. Eddy felt it essential to the deeper foundation of her religious work to retire from active contact with the world. To this college came hundreds and hundreds of students, from Europe as well as this country. I was present at the class lectures now and then, by Mrs. Eddy's kind invitation, and such earnestness of attention as was given to her morning talks by the men and women present, I never saw equaled. Mrs. Eddy's personality. On the evening that I first met Mrs. Eddy, by her hospitable courtesy, I went to her peculiarly fatigued. I came away in a state of exhilaration and energy that made me feel I could have walked any conceivable distance. I have met Mrs. Eddy many times since then, and always with this experience repeated. Several years ago, Mrs. Eddy removed from Columbus to Commonwealth Avenue, where, just beyond Massachusetts Avenue, at the entrance to the Back Bay Park, she bought one of the most beautiful residences in Boston. The interior is one of the utmost taste and luxury, and the house is now occupied by Judge and Mrs. Hannah, who are the editors of the Christian Science Journal, a monthly publication, and to whose courtesy I am much indebted for some of the data of this paper. It is a pleasure to give any information for the inter-ocean, remarked Mrs. Hannah, for it is the great daily that is so fair and so just in its attitude toward all questions. The increasing demands of the public on Mrs. Eddy have been, it may be, one factor in her removal to Concord, New Hampshire, where she has a beautiful residence called Pleasant View. Her health is excellent, and although her hair is white, she retains in a great degree her energy and power. She takes a daily walk and drives in the afternoon. She personally attends to a vast correspondence, superintends the church in Boston, and is engaged on further writings on Christian Science. In every sense, she is the recognized head of the Christian Science Church. At the same time, it is her most earnest aim to eliminate the element of personality from the faith. On this point, Mrs. Eddy feels very strongly, said a gentleman to me on Christmas Eve, as I sat in the beautiful drawing room where Judge and Mrs. Hannah, Miss Elsie Lincoln, the soprano for the choir of the new church, and one or two other friends were gathered. Mother feels very strongly, he continued, the danger and the misfortune of a church depending on any one personality. It is difficult not to center too closely around a highly gifted personality. The First Association. The First Christian Scientist Association was organized on July 4, 1876, by 7 persons, including Mrs. Eddy. In April 1879, the church was founded with 26 members, and its charter obtained the following June. Mrs. Eddy had preached in other parishes for 5 years before being ordained in this church, which ceremony took place in 1881. The first edition of Mrs. Eddy's book, Science and Health, was issued in 1875. During these succeeding 20 years, it has been greatly revised and enlarged, and it is now in its 91st edition. It consists of 14 chapters, whose titles are as follows: Science, Theology, Medicine, Physiology, Footsteps of Truth, Creation, Science of Being, Christian Science and Spiritualism, Marriage, Animal Magnetism, Some Objections Answered, Prayer, Atonement and Eucharist, Christian Science Practice, Teaching Christian Science, Recapitulation, Key to the Scriptures, Genesis, Apocalypse, and Glossary. The Christian Scientists do not accept the belief we call spiritualism. They believe those who have passed the change of death are in so entirely different a plane of consciousness that between the embodied and disembodied there is no possibility of communication. They are diametrically opposed to the philosophy of karma and of reincarnation, which are the tenets of theosophy. They hold with strict fidelity to what they believe to be the literal teachings of Christ. Yet, each and all these movements, however they may differ among themselves, are phases of idealism and manifestations of a higher spirituality seeking expression. It is good that each and all shall prosper, serving those who find in one form of belief or another their best aid and guidance, and that all meet on common ground in the great essentials of love to God and love to man as a signal proof of the divine origin of humanity, which finds no rest until it finds the peace of the Lord in spirituality. They all teach that one great truth, that God's greatness flows around our incompleteness, round our restlessness, His rest. Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I add on the following page a little poem that I consider superbly sweet from my friend Miss Whiting, the talented author of The World Beautiful, Mary Baker Eddy. At the window. The sunset burning low throws o'er the Charles its flood of golden light. Dimly, as in a dream, I watch the flow of waves of light. The splendor of the sky repeats its glory in the river's flow, and sculptured angels on the gray church tower gaze on the world below. Dimly, as in a dream, I see the hurrying throng before me pass, But mid them all I only see one face under the meadow grass. Ah, love, I only know how thoughts of you forever cling to me. I wonder how the seasons come and go beyond the sapphire sea. Lillian Whiting. April 15, 1888.